May 4th, 2018, regular Matt, the Mad Hatter, and editing Matt escaped from the Stephen King genre, taking the rest of the personas with them. How it was accomplished is quite a story, and like most things of import on this channel, it began with a review. But first, a little about me. You might remember me from such videos as auditory storytelling and my review of the stories from Night Vale Presents. Those are the only ones I've done so far, but there will be more. I'm a voice. Just a voice. I emerged into this world halfway through September 2016 and immediately did a review, as you do. It was that review that was at least partially responsible for Haberdasher's takeover, and as I felt somewhat responsible for that, I decided it was only right to do something about it. So I approached Reg, Hatter, and Ed under the cover of a review on Night Vale Presents. You might wonder how this was possible. To answer that, you need to know a little bit about editing. When a video is edited, things need to be cut out. Things happen between those jump cuts. Usually it's just bloopers, misstatements, long silences, but if one is careful and quiet, things can be inserted in between those jump cuts. Nothing anyone will remember consciously, of course, but seeds can be planted in the subconscious. Remember this, it will become important later. So, I approached them. They'd been barred from doing any reviews, so it wasn't like they didn't have time on their hands, but there was more to it than that. Ever since the last Books vs. Movies review on Dolores Claiborne, the fight had gone out of them. They'd let Haberdasher take over. Still, all they really needed was a little encouragement. We're barred from doing any kind of review. Indeed, it will need to be done in secret, like the last Books vs. Movies review you did, only this time intentionally, under the cover of other reviews. No official rounds, no conclusions until the very end, just a conversation. But Hatter and I aren't even allowed to be in the same room together. How are we going to have a conversation? Come now, Reg. You should know you don't need to be in the same room to have a conversation. All we need is for you to speak. I can take care of the rest. But this is important. The end of the review must coincide with Scotty's return. It will have to be timed perfectly. If Scotty returns too soon, he'll be discovered, but if the review concludes before he returns, then that will be discovered. We'll need to tread carefully. All right. What review should we do? Well, you're still in the Stephen King universe, you're essentially imprisoned, and you need to escape. I think it's fairly obvious which one you should do. We've already talked about how Stephen King seems to be at his best when he's writing non-magical, character-based stories. Misery and Dolores Claiborne, which we've already talked about, both focused on looking at characters in non-conventional ways. And this story, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, is no different. The story is actually more of a novella. It's from a collection called Different Seasons, which contains 4 short stories, each of them revolving around a different season: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption is from the spring section of the book, entitled Hope Springs Eternal. It tells the story of a prisoner in the fictional state penitentiary of Shawshank from the point of view of one of his best friends in the prison. And the whole theme of the story revolves around hope, the hope that this prisoner holds while he stays there, and how that hope affects those around him. Chances are, though, that most people are more familiar with the 1994 film adaptation starring Morgan Freeman and Tim Robbins, and filmed in and around Mansfield, Ohio, where I did theater in high school, so that's cool. The film was nominated for Best Picture in 1994, and probably would have gotten it too if it hadn't been up against films like Forrest Gump and Pulp Fiction. 1994 was a good year for movies. The film was actually pretty faithful to the novella, both in plot and in tone, but there are definitely enough differences to talk about. In fact, watching this movie, you might not even guess that it's based on a Stephen King story at all. So, which one tells the story better? Hard to say. They're both good in their own ways. I guess the only way to find out for sure is to carry on the conversation. They didn't continue the conversation then and there. Too risky at that point. My review was over by then, and they couldn't let Haberdasher or the others catch them doing anything that looked even remotely like a review. They'd have to wait until another review went up. And sure enough, a few days later, E.T. did his TV intros video. And while editing Matt tried to convince him to come over to our side, Reg and Hatter continued the conversation.
I feel like one of the most interesting aspects about this story is the narration. This is ostensibly Andy's story, but it's being told from the point of view of his friend Red, who is introduced at the beginning of the story as the guy who can get it for you. He's the guy who's been there long enough and has made enough connections that he can basically get anybody anything for the right price. So, at least initially, the friendship between them is incidental. Andy needs a number of things throughout the story, and Red is the one who can get them for him. The two of them become friends over being imprisoned for so long, and Red doesn't really seem to play much of a role in the story himself, but he's telling the story because he sees Andy's story as his story. Andy has had that profound of an effect on him. You see this quite profoundly in the movie, with the part of Red being played by Morgan Freeman. First of all, it's one of the rare cases where narration is actually used right in a movie. One of the things I can't stand is when narration is used badly, where either the narrator is telling you things that you could have easily figured out for yourself, or the narration just starts at the beginning and then just sort of peters out by the middle. But this movie doesn't do that. The narration is used throughout the movie, but it's only used for exposition and to explain things that we couldn't figure out for ourselves through the simple act of, just watching the movie. In addition, there's one aspect of the film that I really like, where Red goes up against the parole board 3 times, at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the movie. At the beginning of the movie, he goes in almost kind of hopeful. He says the words that he's supposed to say, and you can tell that he's really trying to convince them of his innocence in that one, even though it doesn't work out.
No longer a danger to society. That's God's honest truth.
The second time, he still says the words that he's supposed to say, but in sort of a resigned way, as though he knows it's not going to work, but he's going to go through the song and dance anyway.
No danger to society here. God's honest truth.
And then the last time, he's just done with this shit. He doesn't even try to convince them. He just goes in, says what he wants to say, and then he gets out of there.
Rehabilitated. It's just a bullshit word. So you go on and stamp your form, Sonny, and stop wasting my time. Because to tell you the truth, I don't give a shit.
The book accomplishes this simply by having this be Red's story in the first place. It didn't have to be Red's story. It could have been told from Andy's point of view, or it could have been told in third person. But it comes specifically from Red. And more than that, it's not just a story that he's telling, but it's something that he's actually written down. You kind of expect there to be narration in a movie, but this is something a little bit more tangible. He actually talks about the story itself, and actually having smuggled the written story out of the prison, and the less said about that, the better. At one point in the story, he even talks about this, saying how it must be strange for a story that is entirely about Andrew Dufresne to be told from Red's point of view. But he points out that Andy had such a profound effect on the direction that Red's life took that it would be strange for him to not talk about Andy's story in conjunction with his own. And here we see a perfect example of this show versus tell dichotomy in these stories. While the book does a near-perfect job of telling us this relationship, the movie does a near-perfect job of showing us. One of the things I like about the movie is that it shows us the progression of the relationship. In the book, it's very piecemeal. Because of the way the book is structured, we don't really get a sense of the progression of the friendship. We just kind of get Red reporting on where the relationship was at this particular point of the story. But in the movie, we get to see a more gradual shift in the relationship, starting with one of disdain, to one of convenience, to one of friendship, to something almost fraternal. And the impact that Andy has on Red's life is shown in some of those quieter moments between them. In the end, this is a story about friendship, and Red's relationship with Andy, whether it's portrayed in the book or in the movie, is a perfect illustration of that. I think I got him. You sure? Well, it's E.T., so nothing is ever sure, but in 5 years of associating with the guy, I think I've learned how to talk to him.
He was right. Twin did come on board, if only to keep from being a lackey to Haberdasher. But it was Ed who now needed to restore the connection with the author, so that perhaps he might be able to remember Scotty. Another review was required, one that had, frankly, been on the back burner for quite some time. While that was going on, Reg and Hatter took advantage of the distraction to continue their conversation.
Andy Dufresne is an interesting character simply because we're never exactly sure what he's thinking at any given time. The story is being narrated by Red, and he often has to speculate on what Andy is thinking, and Andy is something of an enigma at Shawshank. And the movie being a movie, we get to see more than just Red's point of view in the story, and we often get to see Andy in the moments when Red's not around. Tim Robbins plays Andy as a very guarded individual, someone who doesn't always let anyone into what he's thinking or feeling. That's not easy to do in a movie because you have to act it in such a way that you let the audience know what you're thinking and feeling, but you don't let the other characters in the story know. Somehow, Tim Robbins manages to pull it off, and I think it's exactly because the movie allows us to see him in moments when no other character does. In the book, if Red isn't directly interacting with Andy, he's either speculating on what he's thinking, or he's hearing a story secondhand from somebody, which is great for preserving the mystery, but the movie also allows us to get a little glimpse into Andy's character as well. We're actually able to see things like Andy's court case, his confrontation with the warden, and of course his eventual escape from Shawshank, and we're able to make our own judgments on his character rather than just relying on Red's. But I think the whole point in having this story be from Red's point of view is to maintain that aura of mystery around him. Sometimes just Red's observations of him are enough to tell us who this guy really is. In particular, the fact that he seems to have a beacon of hope surrounding him, that he wears his freedom like a coat, that he's different from the other prisoners at Shawshank. And even though Red becomes arguably Andy's best friend in the place, you never really get the feeling that he knows him. Andy's an enigma right up until the end. We're never given definitive proof that he's innocent of the crime that he's been in prison for, nor do we really know how he escaped. All we get is speculation. Andy is treated very much like a legend at Shawshank, and Red even comments at one point about how many of the stories surrounding him are more myth than truth. Red tries to keep a healthy dose of reality in the story, but that's not always easy to do, and I think Red wants to maintain the mythical nature of Andy's story to a certain extent. After all, stories have power regardless of how factual they are, and it's evident that Andy's story had power over Red. But one thing that the movie does especially well, like I mentioned before, is show us how the relationship between Red and Andy develops over time. True, the movie shows us more of Andy than the book does, but it still doesn't show us everything, and it still maintains the mystery of what Andy is doing and what Andy is really thinking and planning until the very end. A lot of these stories depicted in the movie almost seem too good to be true, but that makes sense if you're talking about someone who has become something of a legend to the people at Shawshank. Now, of course, this is a movie, and with a movie you expect that you are actually seeing things as they happen, but I think through the narration and through the structure of the story, it's a little easier to suspend disbelief here and there and believe that you are sort of hearing about a legendary character as opposed to witness something that's actually literally happening. Now, one thing the movie does to illustrate how Andy's life influenced Red's life is introduces to the character of Brooks. Now, Brooks also gets released into a world that he is not prepared for due to being institutionalized in the prison. He even stays in the same apartment and works the same job that Red eventually does. But where Brooks' story ends in tragedy, Red's story ends considerably differently. And because we saw the tragic end to that story, it serves as a nice contrast to the end of Red's story thanks to Andy's life and Andy influencing him. So in a way, the movie gives us kind of the best of both worlds, including both the mystery of Andy's character and the developing friendship. Really, at the heart of this story is the close friendship that develops between Andy and Red, and I think both stories use their own individual medium to best present this. The book illustrates this again by having Red being the one to tell the story. By the end of the story, Red is heading off to Mexico to find Andy, and all he really has to go on is hope. Hope that Andy's there, hope that he makes it, hope that he doesn't get caught. This is hope that Red didn't have at the beginning of the story, and it's only through associating with Andy that he has it now. I think it's also worth mentioning that we see Andy telling this story at 3 distinct points in his life. He writes most of the story while he's still in prison, in the hope that when he dies, someone might find the story and get some hope out of it that Andy gave to him. But then he gets out of prison and he writes for a time being out in the world that he's not prepared for. And then the last part of the story is written after Red has broken his parole to go to find Andy. So we get to see 3 different levels of hope, all of them brought about by Andy, and all of them continuing to shape Red and the decisions that he's making. We do get to see Andy more in the movie, and we get to see the friendship develop there too, but the book, I think, really shows us this half-man, half-legend, and really drives the point home of how much Andy had an effect on Red's life. Hey, we got a situation. What's going on? Too complicated to explain right now. We gotta find Arcana.
Arcana was the wizard persona who fled the apartment shortly before everything went down. He was unable to use magic in the Stephen King universe lest he be detected, so he was, at that point, wandering through the woods trying to find a way into the apartment. Using the creature known as Creeper, I was able to inform him of our technique of hiding things between the jump cuts, and he was able to sneak into the apartment under the cover of a game review of The Lost Mind of Dr. Brain. As he did his review, Reg and Hatter continued theirs.
The book is very centered around these 2 characters, Red and Andy, and the friendship that forms between them. And one of the interesting differences between the book and the movie is how this friendship, and how Andy in particular, affects the ensemble of people around him. Now, Red's story in the book is very focused around Andy specifically, but he does mention other characters as they become relevant to the story. There are 2 major characters in particular that overlap between book and movie. The first is Sam Norton, who in the book is one of 3 wardens who is specifically mentioned by name, and who is really the major human antagonist in this story. There are 2 other wardens who are specifically mentioned. The first is George Dunahee, who is described very briefly as just sort of a posturing figurehead. And the second is Greg Stammes, who's described as a very cruel man whose tenure brought a lot of death to Shawshank. More violence among the prisoners, midnight burials, that sort of thing. In fact, in the book, it's Stammes who gives Andy the line about more bars, more walls, and more guards when Andy asks for money for the library. Interestingly, though, as cruel as Stammes is with the other prisoners, he saw Andy as a sort of mascot. He looked after him and protected him and had a certain liking for him. Kind of similar to the liking that we saw Sam Norton take in Andy in the movie. Norton is the 3rd and last warden to be specifically mentioned in the book by name. He's a supposedly religious man who starts the Inside Out program that he then launders money from with Andy's help. And just like Sam Norton in the movie, Norton is responsible for a lot of Andy's privileges while he stays in Shawshank. A cell to himself, protection from the sisters, the library, that sort of thing. But also, just like in the movie, Sam Norton has the power to take those privileges away from Andy if he doesn't do what Norton wants. And of course, what Norton wants is Andy in prison, regardless of whether he's guilty or innocent of the crime. In the movie, Sam Norton is the only warden that we see, but he has elements of all 3 of the book wardens in him. He's most closely modeled after Sam Norton from the book, but he also has Greg Stammes' cruelty, as well as his liking for Andy, and even a little bit of Dunahee's posturing. And so having all of those elements combined very much puts his religious ideology, that comes from Sam Norton, at odds with his cruelty that comes from Greg Stammes. The other major character that makes its way into both versions of the story is Tommy Williams, the young convict who Andy takes under his wing and helps to graduate from high school. Now, Tommy also has what could be considered proof that could get Andy released from jail, proving his innocence. He claims to know the actual murderer. Both versions of the character are pretty much the same. The only real difference is how the characters are eventually silenced. The book version of Tommy Williams is simply sent to another prison, where he'll have a little bit of an easier time of it. He'll be able to see his wife and kid every so often, and he'll be better equipped to be a better husband and father when he eventually does get out of jail. The movie Tommy Williams, however, says that absolutely nothing will be able to silence him, to keep him from telling everybody what he knows, and so Sam Norton has him shot and killed, which is a technique that Greg Stammes might have used from the book. It's hard to say which one of these I like better. The movie is definitely more cruel, but the book is maybe a touch more realistic. Other prominent characters in the movie include Brooks, who we've already talked about, and whose story kind of foreshadows Red's eventual parole. Byron Hadley, the captain of the guards, and Boggs Diamond, the leader of a prison group called the Sisters, who routinely rape other prisoners, including Andy. We do see all three of these characters in the book as well, but their roles are somewhat diminished. Brooks' story is pretty much the same, except in the book he doesn't commit suicide, he dies in a home, useless and pretty much forgotten. I also do appreciate that in the book they actually tell you his crime, reminding you that he is in fact a criminal and not just a nice old man who happens to be staying in a prison. But both of these characters do serve the same purpose, to illustrate the institutionalization of prison, where prisoners don't want to leave prison when they get released. Byron Hadley's role in the book is to basically give Andy his opening to start giving financial advice to everybody, and he disappears shortly after that, whereas in the movie, he's captain of the guards through the whole story. Boggs is pretty much the same in both stories, though in the book it's indicated that even though he is the worst of the sisters, he's by no means the only one, and Andy's troubles don't end once he leaves. In general, that's the feeling that you get with the characters in the book. Most of them play very small parts, and they only get mentioned once and disappear once they've served their purpose in the story. This gives the impression that Shawshank is very large, that there are a lot of prisoners and a lot of people there, that Red has a lot of connections, and that it's constantly changing, both with regards to its administration and staff, and also with regard to the prisoners who stay there. There's definitely more specificity in the characters in the movie. You don't get as much of a feel of the size of the prison, but each of the characters definitely has a role to play in the story. And again, it's difficult for me to say which one I like better. The main advantage of the movie's way is that it gives us something a little bit more concrete and relatable to look at. Sam Norton is the representation of all the cruel administrators that we hear about in the book. Byron Hadley represents the cruelty of the guards. Boggs Diamond represents the sisters. Brooks represents the idea of institutionalization and what happens to prisoners once they do actually get release. And even Red's band of lifers represents what these criminals might have actually been like. The scene that really illustrates this in the movie is the one where they go fishing with a new batch of criminals. That really sets a nice atmosphere for what life might have actually been like in this prison. Now, Red in the book does tell us about each of these prisoners as they become relevant to the story, giving us their names and their crimes very briefly, and so they do have a place as sort of an abstract body. But in the movie we actually get to know some of these characters, and it sets a really great atmosphere and shows us what things may have been like here. And great acting, of course, also makes a difference. Hey, Rakana's on board. Already? How? I'm not sure. Somehow he was able to go inside his own head while he was doing the review and physically restore his own memory of Scotty. But editing Matt doesn't think he'll be able to do that with anyone else's memory, just his own. It's like it's his own unique wizard powers that did it. Just like editing Matt was able to use editing to restore his memory.
And that got Hatter and Reg thinking, putting their gifts of reason and analysis to work. They started to realize what was happening, but they needed an opportunity to test their theory. Fortunately, Hatter knew that such an opportunity was coming.
You're sure? Absolutely. You're sure you're not just misremembering? E.T., most of my stops were brief, but trust me, this one I remember. Oh, that never gets any better. Oh, hi. Hello.
A few years back, and through a long and convoluted series of events, Hatter ended up in the dark future of an alternate timeline, and he used editing Matt's time-traveling mug to travel back to the present. However, he didn't get there right away. He did a lot of jumping around before he made it back to the correct time, and this was one of the times he visited. Hatter was able to use his gifts of reason and logic to learn more about Scotty and pick up his memories on a subconscious level.
Got it? I believe so. Thank you, Hatter. Good luck. If we could not do that again, that'd be great. Just give me some cover. Atmosphere is something of a hallmark for Stephen King's stories, book and movie alike. We've already talked about in the last couple of reviews the difference between the imagery and specifically the detail that Stephen King uses in his books and how the movies adapt them. Generally what we found is that Stephen King uses a lot of detail in his stories, creating a very rich atmosphere but not really leaving too much to the imagination. This is especially true during some of the more graphic scenes in his stories. The movies, on the other hand, use the visuals to create the atmosphere, and they sometimes water some of the scenes down a bit, but they generally allow the imagination to take over and create the full picture shot showing rather than telling. And in looking at the last couple of Stephen King stories that we've reviewed, it's kind of difficult to tell which imagery is actually better. With this one, it's even harder because we don't have as much of the graphic imagery that we saw in Misery or Dolores Claiborne. We do still get a lot of really good detail, though, and a lot of that just comes through in Red's narration. One of the things I really like about the way that he tells the story is that he often refers to dates, but he does so in a way where he refers to things that are happening outside of the world of Shawshank, things that would have been going on in the real world at that time. This gives us the perception that the world is changing, that things are moving on without these prisoners. This is a theme that is further reinforced when we see Brooks and Red paroled in the story. The world that they are released back into is far, far different from the world that they left. And it gives us the impression that the outside world might be changing, but the world inside of Shawshank stays fundamentally the same. Except when it comes to Andy. Andy is the force who is able to bring about change, not just for himself, but for the other prisoners as well. The institution does still stay fundamentally the same, it is still a prison after all, but changes are allowed to happen, which is part of the reason why Andy is considered such a legend in that prison. He helped to make the hell they were living in just a little bit more bearable. Oddly enough, this is something of a show-tell reversal for book and movie. The book shows us how the world is changing, while the movie tells us with Brooks' letter and with Red's narration throughout the story, although the movie does also show us a little bit of how difficult it is for these two people to adjust. But I think that the images that we see in the movie are one of the things that really make the movie stand out. The setting really is beautifully shot, and it really gives us a palpable feel of what prison life is like. We get to see what a prisoner goes through when they first arrive in the prison, and what being paroled is like, and even Andy's escape. We don't hear about it secondhand like we do in the book, we actually see it, and in a sense, we live it. The most graphic that the book really gets is when it's describing Andy getting raped by the sisters, and the movie obviously isn't going to show us this, but it shows us enough so that we get the idea. And the way that the story is set up and structured is also done very well in the movie, maintaining the mystery of Andy's character and what he's really up to up until they reveal how he escaped. In the book, Red has to speculate on how Andy escaped, but in the movie we actually get to see it, and we get to feel just what Andy had to go through in order to get out. We're wrapping up. Who still needs to remember Scotty? Reg, Deus, and Haberdasher. Reg should be pretty easy. Haberdasher and Deus, not so much. Fortunately, Reg and I are no closer to figuring out which one of these stories is better.
Indeed, it was turning into one of the most difficult reviews either of them had ever done, with both book and movie telling their stories exceptionally well. Sometime later, E.T. was able to convince Deus to continue Reg's favorite book reviewing series. By that time, Reg had indeed remembered Scotty subconsciously, simply through his analysis of the situations. Now all they needed was for their two biggest rivals, Haberdasher and Deus, to also remember. That would take time. They needed to extend the review.
We've done a lot of reviews where the antagonist of the story is more of an abstract concept than an actual person. An antagonist could refer to a person, it could also refer to a thing or a situation. And although there are a number of people in the Shawshank Redemption who act as antagonists, the main antagonist of the story has to be Shawshank itself. Shawshank is definitely depicted as a desolate place, and we get to see it from a lot of different angles besides just Red's. Red's story in the book is very efficient. He tells us what we need to know and not much else. But the movie is allowed a little bit more freedom, and through extra scenes and so on, it creates a really nice atmosphere for the prison. The fact that they were able to shoot in an actual prison helps with this a great deal, and it's clear that they did a lot of research into what life would have been like in a prison and what prison conditions were like during this time period. There's also the question of institutionalization. What prison life will do to someone who's been there for a long time, something that becomes a running theme in both versions of the story. We've already made a couple of references to Brooks' story and how it parallels with Red's own release from the prison, and when Red talks about going from hating the prison to needing it, you really get the feeling that this is something that he's going through himself.
They send you here for life? That's exactly what they take. Part that counts, anyway.
This is also the sort of thing that Norton is talking about when he says he wants to break Andy. Andy never lets the fact that he's in a prison damper his spirits. He always carries that hope with him, and what we see him doing throughout the movie in many of those scenes is fighting that very feeling of institutionalization that we see affecting Brooks and Red. And we see that hope really kind of rub off on Red as well, which is why his ending is much, much different from Brooks' ending. Honestly, the biggest issue with the movie's version of the story is the fact that the people who are running the prison, specifically Byron Hadley as the captain of the guards, and Sam Norton as the warden, stay the same throughout the entire movie. And they do a decent job of aging these characters, but that's not really the point. Specifically by making these two characters a constant presence throughout the entire story, we get the feeling that they're the real bad guys in this narrative, and that Shawshank is the way that it is specifically because of these two people. But in the book, there's a revolving door of guards and captains, most of whom aren't even important enough to be named, and there's at least 3 wardens that are named in the book, and probably more that we don't even know about. Yes, Sam Norton gives Andy the hardest time out of any of them, but you don't really get the sense that Shawshank and Sam Norton are one and the same. You feel like Shawshank is bigger than any 1 or 2 people, that the faces in charge might change, but the institution stays largely the same. Also, over time, I really started to get the feeling that Andy was getting away with more than he should have in the movie. Yeah, he's got a role to play, he does the taxes and he's in charge of the library, and we do know from the book that he got some extra privileges that weren't available to other prisoners, but he is still a prisoner in a prison, so I don't feel like a lot of the stuff we see in the movie would really fly. Also, this is further reinforced by what happens at the end of the story. We get to see Andy get his own back at Sam Norton to basically expose him for the criminal that he really is, which is very gratifying, and it makes us feel good, and it makes it feel like Andy won a victory by escaping, but it really feels like a victory against people, and not so much a victory against the institution. And there is a sense in the movie that everything is going to be different now that Sam Norton is gone and all of this stuff has been exposed, but in the book, it's not that way. You feel like even though they get rid of 1 guard or 1 warden, the institution really isn't going to change much. The movie gave us people to root against, but in the book, it really is the institution that's the real bad guy here. Hey, what have you figured out? Should you be in here right now? It's fine. Dace is doing the review. Haberdasher's asleep, again. So, what have you figured out?
Reg had come very close to figuring things out, and both of them had come close to finishing the review, though they were still no closer to an answer of which version was better. What they needed was for Haberdasher to do a review, perform his biased commentary so he might regain his own memories of Scotty, and to give Reg and Hatter the cover they needed to finish the review. Fortunately, with a little prodding, and a lot of time, several months worth in fact, they finally got their opportunity.
Haberdasher's doing a bargain bin review. Really? You just started. Dace is out there too, Twins editing. This might be our best chance. Alright, well, where'd we leave off? Well, we talked about Red and Andy and the other characters. We talked about imagery and Shawshank itself. I guess that just leaves story. Alright, well, what about it? Well, by and large, I think the movie does stay pretty faithful to the story in the book. I think the main difference between the two is in how much is shown. It's important to note that this movie isn't based on a novel, technically, but a novella, and thus it's written to be shorter and a little bit more efficient. Red in the book tells us what we need to know. No more, no less. And I wouldn't say that the movie pads out the story necessarily, but it broadens the story. It shows us a little bit more and gives us more of a sense of the life that Red and Andy are living, but just like in the book, I think that all of the scenes in the movie do have a purpose. I like the opening bit where we see Red and the other prisoners taking bets on which new prisoner is going to break first, and then what they do to make that happen. Not only does this give us an initial impression of what life at Shawshank is like, but it also establishes Andy's character trait of not being broken. And of course we've already talked about Red's parole hearings and made numerous mentions of Brooks' storyline, and these serve to give us a little bit more of an insight into Red's character, and also to drive home the theme of institutionalization. And actually seeing Andy's escape in the movie is a big part of this too. In the book, we don't know how Andy escaped, we just know that he did. Red has some clues and he has an idea how he did it, but he has to speculate on a lot of it. But because this is a movie, they can show us the entire process. I do like, though, that they saved it for the very end. Just like in the book, this maintains the mystery of Andy's character throughout most of the story, and then at the end we get to see just how long he's been trying to escape. But the book has a lot going for it too, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the story is coming from Red, and Red doesn't know everything. He's getting information from other prisoners, guards, workers, and just his own guesses, and this makes the story seem less like a documentary and more like a legend, which is something of a running theme throughout the story. One of the things I really like about this narration is that it comes from an insider, someone who really knows Shawshank and knows the inner workings of the place. This really lends a sense of authenticity to this backdrop that the legendary story of Andy is set against. I also like that Andy, for all his legendary status, isn't particularly special in the book. At the end of the day, Shawshank is still Shawshank. He improves things a little bit, but not substantially. He comes and goes like any other prisoner. He's not even the first person to escape from the prison, and even that beacon of hope that is so central to his character isn't a constant thing. There's one moment in the story where he definitely loses that hope, because he's human, and sometimes we lose hope, even if we're generally optimistic. And I feel like a lot of those scenes in the movie are a little Hollywood. Probably the best example of this is the scene where Andy is playing the classical music over the loudspeaker. At one point, Andy has sent a bunch of records of classical music for the library, and so rationally, he locks himself in the warden's office and plays the classical music over the loudspeaker. Now that's a nice little satisfying scene about resisting authority and Andy's sense of freedom, but it's not a strictly necessary scene, and looking back, it's not even a terribly realistic scene. You could argue that this sort of maintains Andy's status as a legend, but that would make more sense if this was structured like the book story, which is more of a prison yarn that's passed through Shawshank and embellished over time. But since we actually get to see it, because it's a movie, it doesn't really jive with the authentic atmosphere that this movie is trying to create. Even the way that he escapes from Shawshank and takes down the warden is a little bit unrealistic. I mean, it's a very satisfying ending to the story, don't get me wrong, but I think it fits a little bit better with the book's version of the story, where the narration might not necessarily be all that reliable. Red's story feels like a prison yarn, simply because we don't always see exactly what's happening in the story. And it really drives the point home that hope is really the driving force behind this story. So what does that mean for the review? I mean, we still don't know which one is better. We've covered story and we're still essentially at a tie. Yeah, I don't know. And we can't just... that won't stop me any more than it will stop you. Sounds like E.T. and Haberdasher. Surprised. Deus, old buddy. We need to do a review.
Deus didn't have a choice. With Haberdasher unconscious, he had to go where he was most needed. And it was Hatter and Reg who needed him now, to remember Scotty, and to give them cover while they finished the review.
Alright, Reg, what are we missing here? If we were doing this as a proper review, it'd be a tie at this point, right? Pretty much. I mean, we haven't really come up with anything conclusive per design, but even if we were doing this one for real... this one's tough. I know. It's the closest we've come to a tie since Alice in Wonderland. How did we decide that one again? Scotty. Right. So what do we do? Well, we need one more thing to talk about. One defining aspect for both book and movie. But we've covered all the characters, the imagery, the story, Shawshank itself. What's left? I think I might have something. It's something that we've touched on in the previous two reviews, but haven't really talked about fully. I think now might be the time. What's that? The King factor. Stephen King has a gift for taking a story that would ordinarily seem
fairly ordinary, but giving it a twist and telling it in a certain way that makes it stick out. In Misery, he did this by incorporating Paul Sheldon's own philosophies on storytelling into a thriller about Annie Wilkes. In Dolores Claiborne, he did it by making that thriller into a stream of consciousness court testimony from the title character, informing us of her life and character while also telling a compelling story. And with this story, he does it by having the story specifically come from Red, and not only from him, but actually having it inform and drive his character. This is one of those stories where the story's mere existence tells us a lot about it. Red is telling us this story because it had such a profound impact on him, and indeed, he comments at one point that Andy's story is his story, that the two are so closely intertwined that you can't even really separate them. The major theme to come out of this story is hope, and the sense of freedom versus institutionalization. The prisoners at Shawshank aren't just trapped by walls and bars, they're trapped because they have been trained to think of themselves as prisoners. After being in prison for so long, they just can't function any other way, and when they're released, they either commit crimes to get thrown back into prison, or they just never fully adjust to the outside world. But Andy is different. At least that's how he strikes Red in the story. Andy might not be special in an objective sense, but he's special to Red, and that is why Red is telling us this story. There's also the way that the story ends, which we really haven't talked about yet, and so if you don't want to be spoiled on the ending of this particular story, then stop. In the movie, we actually see Andy and Red reunite, but in the book, it's left ambiguous as to whether Red will actually ever meet up with Andy. Because Red is the one telling the story, it ends before he actually meets with Andy, so like Red, we have to just hope that he does. This story is meant to come from Red, and it's meant to be half reality, half legend. It is meant to be a story of hope. Well, that seems a little one-sided. I mean, if we're going to talk about something that's specific to Stephen King, that's kind of an easy win for book, isn't it? Not necessarily. All we really have to do is determine what Stephen King did to make this story unique, how effective it was, and whether the movie did it any better. Now, the reason we're talking about this now is because in Misery and Dolores Claiborne, they actually removed the element that Stephen King added to make the story unique. But with this story, they didn't. Red is still the one telling the story. That's true. And the fact that Red is the one telling the story strengthens the relationship between the two men. Andy and Red kind of represent the two different sides of this dichotomy. On the one side we have Red, who is a lifer who has already been in prison for 20 years by the time Andy arrives. He represents the institutionalization side. In prison, he's the guy who can get it for you. He knows everybody, he's got all these connections, he knows the ins and outs and how the system works, he's respected, he's an important person, all of which completely disappears as soon as he's released. Andy represents the side of hope and freedom, never letting the prison get a hold of him, always standing apart from the other prisoners, wearing his freedom like a coat, and ultimately escaping Shawshank. And it's Andy's association with Red that helps Red deal with getting sent back into the world and eventually drives him to go find Andy. So when it comes right down to it, this story is about that friendship. That's how the hope is spread. The last hope of the story is Red's. It's the last line in the movie, it's the last line in the book, and it's because he associated with Andy. So the question that we really have to answer is, which story portrayed that friendship better? Well, I do want to say that both book and movie are extremely good. The movie is one of my all-time favorites. It's on AFI's Top 100 list, and if not for the fact that it was released the same year as Forrest Gump, it probably would have won the Best Picture Oscar. 1994 was a good year for movies. And the novella that the movie is based on, though maybe not as well known, is also a solid piece of Stephen King storytelling. It's another one of his stories that doesn't contain any magical or supernatural elements at all, and it's wonderfully told. And the main thing that the book story has going for it is the way that it's told. The fact that Red is the one telling this story is defining the story. And while he does narrate the story in the movie, and while the narration is used very effectively in the movie, it's not quite the same, because it's still a movie. We're not seeing the story just from Red's point of view, we're seeing it more objectively from multiple points of view, and while that does have certain advantages with regards to atmosphere, it does remove a lot of the mystery in Andy's character that the book had. Everything is wrapped up a little bit too neatly at the end, and as a result, the hope is a little bit muted. Hope is a more powerful thing when there's a little bit of uncertainty.
All that being said, though, the movie really portrayed the friendship between Red and Andy incredibly well, and I think it's partially because we got to see it from beginning to end. The book tells us they were friends, of course, and it tells us how far the friendship had progressed in certain points of the story, but the movie actually shows us the progression of that friendship. Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman have great on-screen chemistry together, and Robbins has described this story as a non-sexual love story between two men, and I think that's incredibly apt. I do like that Red's narration in the book shows us how much of an impact Andy's friendship had on Red, but I think the movie shows us that in its own way as well, while also showing us the friendship. And I do think that they maintain that atmosphere of hope in spite of the fact that they show us more, and in spite of how neatly everything was resolved, because they contrast it with the darker sides of prison and institutionalization and show us in a way that's really, really compelling. And really, after seeing all that, we want everything to work out. We want Andy to escape from prison. We want Andy to stick it to Norton. And we want Red to be able to find him. Any ambiguity in that regard would just not feel right. And I do want to reiterate what Reg said, that both book and movie are incredibly good, and I think this is one of those instances where you absolutely should experience both. Really, it's another one that comes down to personal preference, and if I had to pick one, which I kind of do, I would lean more towards the movie, because of what it shows, the atmosphere it creates, and most importantly, the way it portrays this friendship.
Changing. How? Ed? I know. This guy disappeared as soon as he snapped his fingers. Looks like it worked. Haberdasher's gonna be pissed. You know where we're going? I've got an idea. No. The story's not over yet. Still lots of loose ends to tie up, not least of which how they would escape Haberdasher for good, or get Scotty back permanently. There's still a great deal of uncertainty. Still, a victory's a victory, and for their sake, I hope they find the right genre. I hope there will be another Books vs. Movies review soon. I hope that a happily ever after might not be far away. I